For a number of years now, I've been aware of the extraordinary job that carers do throughout this country. I got a tiny glimpse of it when my mother was suffering from dementia, and I, for a very short time, became her primary carer, at which point I realised what an enormous job it was, dealing with someone who had frontal lobe dementia and had to bring in the professionals. I was fortunate I was able to do that, but we have thousands of people in this country who do not do that, who are themselves carers and look after a loved one, a member of their family. And as a result of that, I became involved at a fairly sort of low level with carers organisations and got to see the enormous job that carers do. I read an article recently written by one of the carers who said we're invisible, and he's absolutely right. Carers are invisible in that society as a whole really doesn't know who these people are because they don't wear a uniform. And also because very often carers, as I've discovered by talking to so many of them over the years, very often feel isolated because it's a daughter who's looking after elderly parents, it's a son who's looking after an elderly mother, it's a husband looking after his wife, it's a wife looking after her husband, it's children looking after parents. There are thousands of teenagers, young people in this country who look after a child, a parent, a loved one, and then go to school. And we don't see these people because they do that job. They do it because they love the people that they're looking after. They do it out of love and out of duty, and they do it out of enormous generosity to the British government. I feel that it's important that anybody who has any knowledge at all of what carers do stand up and be counted for them and make the job that they do public, because they should not be invisible. They should be out there and being seen as the heroes and the heroines that they are, and the job that they're doing. And the government should recognise how important that role is, which is why I'm very happy today to be involved with Carers Week and to ensure that every MP that I meet today knows how important they are and takes that message back, not just to their constituency, but also to the House of Commons, which is just over the road from where we are now, so that we can actually improve the lot of carers throughout the country. I think when I took on the role of carer, and it was for a very short time, what really surprised me was the way that you just sort of fell into it without realising that that's what you were doing. The other thing that struck me immediately was, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing here. My mother had frontal lobe dementia. I knew a little bit about it, of course. I'm a journalist. I've worked on health programmes on the radio and the television, and I've done enough stories about Alzheimer's and dementia to know about the symptoms and what's likely to happen. When I saw those things manifesting themselves in my mother, I recognised she had dementia, but I didn't know how I was supposed to deal with it. And you go through this very sharp learning curve where, as the person who is suffering from dementia begins to change their personality and their character. My mother was a businesswoman, and she was always, quite sort of self-assertive, but she was never unpleasant, she was never nasty, she was never loud. And suddenly, my mother would turn like that into a complete and utter nightmare. And at the start, I would lose my temper with her, and we'd argue. And because there was no rule book, there was no book of instructions, I had to learn, that's not what you do. You don't do that. So it was a very, very sharp learning curve. And then I recognised that there were other things that were going on in her life over which I had no, first of all, control, and of which I had no knowledge, which is why at that point I handed it over to the professionals. But I think that's what you learn about it, that actually we know nothing. And I think that's why so many people almost sort of slide into the job of becoming a carer, because they take on these responsibilities. They suddenly think, oh, I know how to cope with that, and so they do it. And the little thing that started as coping with change in personality or the agoraphobia or the anxiety suddenly becomes an ability to cope with all of the other things that pile up on the back of it. And suddenly you find yourself absolutely swamped with it. And that's when carers can very often feel isolated. What I think is really important is that there is an awful lot of work being done for those people who do need help, the people who suffer from dementia, the people who have physical or mental disabilities. We've got to think about the carers and the effect that the work and the job that they do has on them. The isolation is only a part of it. It's the physical trauma, the mental anxiety and trauma that they go through, the fact that very often they have to give up their jobs and they are alone and there's very often no one to turn to. And what effect is that having on the carer? These are people who need respite, they need support, they need help, they need that wonderful sort of, if you like, safety net to make sure that they are not the ones who collapse under the strain of what they're doing. About a year ago, I was at a conference that was attended by carers in Lincolnshire. I think the organisers, and certainly I, was amazed by the number of people who had heard about that through their local radio and local advertising and local newspapers, who turned up and said, I'm a carer. This is the first time I've had any conversation with, involvement with, any kind of support system. These are people who are not just isolated, they are left on their own. And very often they don't know who is going to support them. They don't realise that the job that they're doing is one that can give them some kind of benefit. So even though it is a pittance compared with the sort of money that's paid to other people, an awful lot of people are not only not claiming it, they're not getting it because they didn't know they were entitled to it. I remember meeting one young woman, she was in her 40s. Her husband had early onset dementia, and she'd been looking after him since he was in his mid-30s. She said, I had no idea I was allowed to claim money for this. She just didn't know. We don't do enough to make it clear. And maybe, I meet an awful lot of elderly people who will say, oh no, I'm not going to claim that. No, I don't want to be dependent on the state. There's a pride and a dignity which says I don't do that. And I think that very often, perhaps for all the wrong reasons, there's a pride and a dignity with carers who don't acknowledge themselves that they're carers, and the minute that they do, see that somehow as a defeat, as if they've kind of thrown in the towel. It's not. If you do that job, and you do it with love and for all the right reasons, you should be rewarded for it in some way. And therefore the government has got, look at all the money it spends on doing other daft advertising campaigns, again, everybody nowhere. They need to spend money on some kind of advertising campaign. They need, and I know we're talking about, cuts or savings, whichever word you prefer to use in local government that has got departments that are responsible for looking after the elderly, has got to get out there and be much more vocal and say, if you are a carer, this is what it means to be a carer. If you are doing this, ergo, you are able to claim that for the job that you do. There are enough doctor surgeries who know that they have people coming through the door who've got various things that are wrong with them that require care at home. Why aren't we, I know patient-doctor confidentiality, but why aren't we hearing from doctor surgeries the people that need help? There are an awful lot of areas and avenues through which we can find who these people are, offer them help. Don't go to them if you think that, knocking on the door and saying, are you a carer, can I help you, is going to in some way diminish their dignity. But find a way. We're in the 21st century. We've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, we've got the internet, we've got television, we've got local radio, we've got newspapers. There's no shortage of avenues of communication with people. Let's find the right way to communicate with every person in this country. Every young child, every elderly husband or wife or daughter or son, and everybody in between that is looking after someone as a carer. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of humanity for us to find a way of getting to them and saying, you are a carer, this is what you're entitled to. Let's start there, and then let's start saying, actually you're entitled to that, but really it's not enough, let's give you a bit more. Because until we start doing that, there's going to be, and I hate to use the word, but it's true, there's going to be an underclass of people who are shut away, who are themselves perhaps eventually going to have awful physical or psychological problems, and we don't want that either. Those people should be able to know who they are, what they're entitled to, and find, this is not a handout from the government, it's a reward, it's payment for a brilliant job being well done. I've met women in their 40s and their 50s and their 60s who are looking after elderly parents. I have friends who look after their own parents regularly, knowing that if they didn't do it, because this is the other problem, you see, very often the person after whom you're looking themselves is not prepared to admit they need help. No, I don't want a stranger coming into the house. I remember my mother saying that to me, I don't want strangers coming into the house. Therefore, if you like, the role of carer is forced upon them because, you know, if you love your parents, if you love somebody in your family, you know that you can't leave them to their own devices because they're going to struggle, they're going to have an accident, they're not going to eat properly, they're not going to be able to cope. And you can't bear to see them doing that, so you become a carer. And eventually you have to find a way of saying, actually, I think we need a bit of help here. So yes, I mean, I do have friends who are going through that at the moment, who have an elderly mother. I have other friends where the father has recently gone into a care home. So yes, I do know, and so I do know the strain that it puts on them. But at the same time, and this is, I think, where the government benefits, it's a strain that people accept willingly and lovingly. And if they're prepared to do that, I think as a civilized nation we should be prepared to do something in return for them.